The video game industry is in shambles. Beloved pioneers of our favorite memories evaporated from relevance, gone in the blink of an eye, victims of the video game crash of 1983. For those who remained, battered yet defiant, a chance to reconquer their domain, our living rooms, was on the horizon. Like a phoenix from the ashes, Atari, often scapegoated for the crash, stood tall, tending to its wounds and preparing to rejoin the fray. Meanwhile, competitors like Epoch and Nintendo also readied themselves, laying the groundwork for a video game renaissance. These pivotal moments and decisions would undoubtedly shape the future. Spanning from 1983 to 2003, this period became known as the third generation of gaming, commonly referred to as the 8-bit era.
As a kid, many of my favorite memories were in the arcade, and the concept or even the sheer capability of having those favorite moments in my own house, I never thought it would be possible. The second generation was the start of many of our video game experiences, but when the market crashed in 1983, I never knew if I would see anything like Atari ever again. I knew it was possible, and so did the rest of the world. After all, it was a lucrative industry. Well, that's what many who grew up with the second generation of gaming might say. But with the video game market in cardiac arrest, who could possibly accept the responsibility of bringing a defibrillator back into the mix? Well, Japan. For those of you who didn't watch the last episode, there weren't that many companies that made it out of the second generation. Nintendo didn't contribute that much out of handheld titles, known as the Game & Watch, and Epoch, while they had their dedicated second-generation console, it didn't exactly pan out the way they would have wanted.
Magnavox also had a weird success and failure in the Odyssey too. Fundamentally, it was a high contender, but once the heavy hitters like the 2600, Intellivision, and the ColecoVision came into the spotlight, Magnavox didn't stand a chance. Even VTech had a console with the Grey Division, but again, it wasn't successful. So where does that leave us? Nintendo, Atari, Magnavox, now branded as Philips, and Epoch. Those were the lucky few who survived and would have to recover from the industry mistakes made by many that fell before. The Japanese market was ripe for the taking. Epoch's cassette vision didn't make the cut, and Nintendo had plenty of time to sit back and ponder their next move.
The issue was, Nintendo didn't have a leg to stand on. Their arcade games were lackluster at best. We all know Donkey Kong, but even Donkey Kong for the longest time wasn't mass-produced outside of the arcade. When it came time to port it, Atari and Coleco would constantly battle for licensing rights to the game. Their other arcade games, such as Computer Othello, Sheriff, Monkey Magic, Hellfire, and Popeye, didn't stand a chance when pitted against the likes of Space Invaders, Galaga, and Moon Patrol. But what they did have was Donkey Kong and Mario, two critical franchises that would be their ticket to fame in the home console market.
In fact, Nintendo wanted to bypass this generation of gaming and go straight for the 16-bit era, with a computer that utilized a keyboard and a floppy disk drive. But the president of Nintendo at the time, Hiroshi Yamauchi, decided that it was too intimidating to the average consumer with little knowledge of electronics. Thus, the project Famicom was born, a game computer known in Japan as the Pasokon, or personal computer. Pretty simple, pretty efficient, and straight to the point. But Nintendo engineer Masayuki Uemura's wife came up with an even better idea, a computer for families, the Famicom. By taking the Rico chip from Donkey Kong and putting it in the Famicom, and with a little Japanese innovation, the home cassette type video game Family Computer was created.
But these talks of creating a new console stirred up the spirit of competition. Japanese arcade manufacturers were shocked and surprised by Nintendo's refusal to participate in the second generation and welcomed the next era of gaming. But who did it first? The answer might shock you.
Did you know that one of the most well-known companies in gaming history started as a subsidiary of Gulf and Western? It was a different world back then, and a company by the name of Standard Games of America would make amusement machines, such as slot machines. As time went on, this mania of slot machines would leap across the pond to Japan, where Standard Games would be rebranded as Service Games. Now, you might not recognize the name right off the bat, but what if we took away 8 of those letters? That's better. Sega. Sega was a heavy hitter in the arcade spectrum, but they hadn't yet tried their hand at making their own home hardware. Their titles such as Head-On, Frogger, and Zaxxon were all making tons of money for the company, but once the early 80s rolled around, the arcades started to fade. Sega saw Nintendo starting to focus on making their family computer, so Sega decided to make a computer of their own as well, the SC3000.
The SC3000 was great. It was a computer that played a limited library of games, but it wasn't internationally released. Once they caught wind that Nintendo was thinking of releasing a video game console in 1983, they started working on creating the little brother of the SC3000, the SG-1000, releasing the SG-1000 on the same day as the Famicom. Thus, on the day of the Lord, July 15th, 1983, the third generation of gaming was born. Between Nintendo's Famicom and Sega's SG-1000, the Japanese market's worry about the crash seemed to fade away. After all, this was the next generation, the next era of gaming, complete with 8 bits of glorious noise and visuals that weren't available at the time. But the question of sales had to be pondered. The Famicom and the SG-1000 both were solely localized principally in Japan, and if Nintendo and Sega wanted a chance to cement their positions, they would need to go worldwide.
Nintendo answered this dilemma by releasing Famicom hardware in the US, in the arcade specifically, as the Nintendo Versus system. Yamauchi's decision to introduce American audiences to their next home console in the arcades was a brilliant strategy that paid off in the end. Inevitably, this would lead to the Nintendo Entertainment System, but not before a pit stop calling it the Advanced Video System. The AVS was similar to the idea of the original Famicom. It had a cassette drive, looked like a computer, and had wireless controllers and components. But engineer Masayuki Uemura had an oddball concern. Uemura was worried that in high-static environments like Arizona, New Mexico, or even Texas, the ROM cartridges they had planned would be susceptible to electrostatic discharge. His opinion directly impacted the design of the console and would result in the low insertion force front-loader NES that we all know and love today. They also focused on quality. Companies that released games on the NES were limited to a set number of titles, and in agreeing to this, as well as Nintendo's strict censorship rules, a development company would earn the coveted seal of quality.
But Sega handled it a little bit differently. They never released the SG-1000 in any capacity to the United States, instead focusing on releasing it to Spain and Italy. Also, internally, there were some issues arising with Sega. David Rosen, the president of Sega of America and former Air Force officer that brought Sega's name to fame, decided to resign the same year the SC-1000 was released, and Hayao Nakayama, who was president of Sega of Japan, was selected to lead all components of the combined and reformed Sega enterprises. Under Nakayama's tenure, the SG-1002 or Mark II was released, but again, Sega was falling ever so slightly behind, which resulted in another revision, the Sega Mark III, but this time it was released everywhere, known as the Sega Master System.
The Master System in America was a very small footprint when compared to the NES, but in a weird turn of events, the Sega Master System was a huge hit in Europe. Distributed by Mastertronic in the UK, Master Games in France, and Areola Soft in West Germany, I know, odd name. But we received many more PAL titles than America did with their NTSC library. This allowed Nintendo to capitalize heavily in America. But the interesting thing to consider is that the SMS has some of the most definitive versions of arcade titles for the home console at the time. If Sega had an arcade game, you could count on it being ported to the SMS much more efficiently than what NES had to offer. But that's where Sega's success stopped in the third generation of gaming.
From what many consider to be the darkest time to the brightest time, we watched as those who survived created seconds of frustration, minutes of focus, hours of entertainment, days of perseverance, and a legacy that would last a lifetime. We were introduced to franchises that would grow with us, and companies that would usher in not only memories for ourselves, but for our children as well. The stage was set, and the conditions of the duel were established. Two mighty titans of a newly refreshed industry were planting charges and preparing to light the fuse in what would ultimately culminate into a war unlike any other, the console war. While we addressed the history of some of these companies, at least those that mattered, we want to paint the landscape of video game history by presenting some of the consoles that were created during this generation. Bear in mind, there were at least 21 known consoles, so for this episode, we'll only be covering those that made the biggest impact, starting with Sega.
Much like Nintendo, we already covered the history of Sega earlier. But if you want a deep dive into the history of Sega, then feel free to check out the Ready Go Gaming Show entry all about Sega. Returning to the SG-1000, it was a tiny little console with hardwired controllers. It played cartridges as well as cassettes if you had the keyboard attachment, which, if you ask me, means that it was pretty versatile at the time given the mediums that would be the new norm, such as cartridges. The follow-up, the SG-1002, wasn't really that much different. It just featured quality of life improvements. For starters, the wired controllers were pulled out and replaced by detachable joypads, and it was during this time that Sega MyCards were introduced. This was because Sega's former consumer hardware development head, Hideki Sato, thought that the cartridges looked like little black tombstones. I mean, yeah, I could see that.
But the big console that marked semi-success for Sega during this time was the Mark III, which was rebranded as the Sega Master System for international release. This sleek black console has one of the weirdest controller feels you'll ever experience, partly because the wire comes out in an inconvenient place. The console itself is cool though. It plays cartridges as well as card-based titles and even has a fancy little pause button on the console. The big downfall for this console was that Sega was not keen on letting third-party developers get anywhere near their console. Nintendo, on the other hand, had policies that did allow third-party developers, and in my opinion, that's what kind of set their quality apart. There would be a smaller compact version of the Sega Master System, known as the Sega Master System 2 colloquially, and it's a cute little console. Other than that, the Sega Master System was kind of a behind-the-scenes sort of console. You either knew what it was, or you had a Nintendo.
But where Sega faltered during their inaugural entry to the home console market, they would strive to be, shall we say, the genesis of the upcoming 16-bit generation. Sega intensified their tactics to outpace their competitor Nintendo and launched an advertising campaign claiming that their console does what Nintendo don't, a slogan that would live in infamy.
Again, we already covered Nintendo because it was the highest seller of video game consoles with their Famicom, but there was more than meets the eye with Nintendo during this generation. In Japan, we had the Famicom. It was a tiny plastic hulk with a courtesy ejector slide and two hardwired controllers, one of which had a microphone built in, that carried with it tons of exclusives, as many weren't culturally relevant enough to port to America. During its initial run, it wasn't successful, and that was due to a bad chipset that had caused many systems to crash. But once they replaced the motherboard, they were good to go, and the rest is history. In America, we got the Nintendo Entertainment System, another hulking piece of plastic that emulated the mechanical actions of a VCR. This mechanism would be referred to as the low insertion force tray. The NES had two ports for detachable controllers, and many of the franchises that saw massive success in Japan were inevitably ported to the NES.
We've already mentioned the AVS, so I think it's only fair we talk about how that went down. The company that Nintendo wanted to work with was Atari. Yeah, trust me, we know. It was supposed to be released as the Nintendo AVS, similar to how Atari released the VCS, and the deal was supposed to be agreed upon at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in 1983. But Atari realized something was a bit off. If you watched the last episode, we talked about how the ColecoVision had a full-up computer known as the Coleco Atom, and Atari noticed it was playing Donkey Kong. This was not legal, mainly because Atari had the license to port it to their 2600 and Coleco did not. Obviously, this caused some distress with the deal, and in the end, it never happened, but let's be honest, it's probably better that it didn't.
The NES was simple, and it never received any expansions or experimental add-ons, but the Famicom, on the other hand, did. The Famicom Disk System released in 1986. Often referred to as the FDS, the Famicom Disk System was a system that utilized floppy disks known as disk cards, but if you take a look at them, they really aren't that floppy, and they are very susceptible to damage. The FDS had a revised sound chip, specifically the 1-extra-channel Ricoh 2C33. This thing was a massive improvement to the sound you could get from the Famicom, but again, it had its flaws. It was expensive, it was slow, it was unreliable. One of the cooler things you could do, however, would be to take your discs to specialty kiosks and rewrite the software on there. For example, this copy of Mario 2 that I have, the B-side is Zanek, a vertical shooter. The key issue with this console is that through time, it just wasn't sustainable, and it was discontinued 3 years later.
But don't worry. While the disk system didn't fare very well, it didn't remotely impact Nintendo in the slightest. And their competitive edge over Sega would bleed into the next generation, where things are about to get super interesting.
Didn't think you'd see these guys on the list, did you? Well, they did make a console, but it wasn't that impactful. If you recall in the last episode, Atari released the VCS and the 5200, and with the naming of the 5200, the VCS was retconned as 2600. What happens when you add 2600 to 5200? You get the superpower of 7800. This is exactly what they called their next console, the Atari 7800 Pro System, but most people refer to it as 7800. But did you know it was originally supposed to be called the 3600? Yeah, math. Historically, Atari was getting pushed around by its main competitor, Coleco. So much so that they were constantly threatening each other with lawsuits based on copyright violations. Coleco wasn't really in the right though. They 100% released an add-on to the ColecoVision that played 2600 games, which is a huge no-no. But what do you expect from people who made leather and suddenly said, hey, let's go make some video games?
But back to the 7800, it was the first Atari console not made by Atari. Instead, it was made by the General Computer Corporation, which was a printer company. Yeah, a printer company. GCC would take the television interface chip, or TIA, of the 2600 and put it in a black box with a janky controller while Warner Brothers were breaking up Atari like nobody's business. GCC, meantime, wasn't getting paid for making the 7800, and between Jack Tramiel and Warner Brothers, nobody could figure out who needed to pay them. Because of this, the initial run of the 7800 was plagued with failures, and 6 years later it was discontinued. But the 7800 can claim one major accomplishment. It was one of the first consoles to have built-in backward compatibility. It could play 2600 titles, but that was the only major selling point for it. The 7800's library is rather small, with only 58 official releases during its lifespan, many of which were arcade ports. We do want to mention that Atari had a series of microcomputers, the Atari ST as well as the Atari XE video game system, commonly referred to as the XEGS. But we aren't going to cover them here today because we would like to do an episode strictly about the entire home microcomputer game industry at some point in the future. Just know the XEGS is a repackaged Atari 65XE computer, and that it was compatible with most Atari 8-bit computer software as well as peripherals. In fact, the only way you could play the few light gun games on the Atari 7800 was by using the gun made for the XEGS.
The Atari 7800 was interesting to say the least, but it didn't stand a chance against the NES or the Mega System. Atari would flee from the battlefield and watch from a distance, like a jaguar hunting its prey.
It's so interesting to consider that one of the pioneers of the industry would fall from grace so suddenly once the market crashed. Atari would survive everything in the overall scope of the industry, but Magnavox was on a slippery slope. In 1974, right around the release of the Odyssey, Philips purchased Magnavox. That's why sometimes you see Philips Odysseys out there in the wild, but Magnavox was still in charge of making consoles, and their contribution to the third generation was a wacky one. It was known as the Philips VideoPack Plus G7400. Yeah, great name, right? It was also only released in Europe. There was an American release planned called the Odyssey 3 Command Center, which was going to be an upgrade of the Odyssey 2, replacing the membrane keyboard with a mechanical keyboard, a modem, a speech synthesizer, and even the ability to play laser discs. But in the end, it fell short severely and was inevitably cancelled. The G7400, which was the successor to the international release of the Odyssey 2, known as the VideoPack G7000, ultimately suffered the same fate. It just wasn't great.
Philips would slowly disappear from relevance. Decision makers, particularly those in boardrooms, believed that during the fourth generation it was prudent to re-establish their empire with an interactive system based on compact discs. This effort ultimately led to the creation of what many consider one of the worst video game consoles ever made.
When you think of Japanese developers, you likely think of Nintendo, Sega, and Epoch. But there was a console created in 1983 after the crash that featured 6 whole games, the Nichibutsu MyVision. Oh, and those 6 games? They're all board games, either developed by Nichibutsu or Logitech. Nichibutsu, the video game development branch for Nihon Bunsan, was created in 1970 by Sueharu Torii, mainly as an arcade machine sales brokerage, but as time went on, they did inevitably enter the arcade development industry. Some of their contributions would be Table Attacker, a blatant ripoff of Breakout, or Moon Alien, a blatant ripoff of Galaxian. Of course, Namco was pissed about it, as they should be. But thankfully, Nihon Busan was able to create games Moon Cresta and Crazy Climber, which are often credited with creating the platformer genre. But then they went crazy and created a subsidiary called Sphinx, which pioneered the strip Mahjong genre. Oh, and also decided to say that Moonbase from Taito and Moon Alien were all original works. Do you see a trend here? That's theft, buddy.
Nichibutsu would inevitably shut down after years of developing titles for future consoles, but in 2014 they sold the rights to Hamster Corporation and disappeared from the gaming industry altogether. If you've ever had the luxury of doing math, you know exactly who Casio is. After all, they made the first electric compact calculator and kicked ass at making cameras. Throughout the 80s and the 90s, they led the pack for Japanese electronics and technologies. I'm talking keyboards of the computer and musical variety, watches, of which were the first to tell you time zones, the first 3-megapixel camera, the first LCD camera, the first to use a ceramic lens with Lumicera. They did it all. But they decided to make a video game console in 1983 known as the PV-1000. It was a boring, horrible attempt to continue the second generation of gaming, and it featured 13 games, all of which sucked. There was a second version, known as the PV-2000, which had 12 games, all of which sucked. You know, it's hilarious to think that the PV-1000 lasted less than a year, and the PV-2000 only lasted a few weeks.
Well, at least Casio tried. But you can't be the world's most innovative consumer electronics manufacturer without trying to appeal to a niche audience, right? If the men didn't like their console, maybe the women would.
Ah, Epoch. the company that thought the second generation of gaming was going to stick around. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, while Atari was the predominant suspect for horrible games in America, Epoch managed to snag the same reputation in Japan. But what was so strange is that the cassette vision they released in the second generation did surprisingly well, accounting for 70% of the Japanese home market at the time. But once pretty much anyone else came into the fray, whether it was Sega, Nintendo, or even Casio, they didn't stand a chance. Their contribution would be Super Cassette Vision, released in 1984, along with a female revision known as the Super Lady Cassette Vision. It had 30 games and was grossly unsuccessful, leading Epoch to drop out of the console market for good. From a company that made the first wireless Pong console, they simply couldn't contend with Nintendo.
Amstrad. It doesn't get much more British than that. Created in 1968 by a 21-year-old lad named Alan Sugar, Sugar started AMS Trading. Amstrad, for a long time, focused on consumer electronics in Britain, most of the time creating amplifiers and tuners for a much lower cost than industry standards at the time. As expected with technology, once the 80s rolled around, the home computer was starting to become a phenomenon. Some of their computers included the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, Plus 2 and Plus 3, and even the NC100 notepad computer. But the first computer they introduced to the public, and the most successful at the time, was the CPC 464. Now, we aren't going to get into the meat and bones of computers' histories because, let's be honest, as we already said, it would be its own episode. What helped Sugar products stand out over those from the competition was their general all-in-one nature. Differing from previous microcomputers, which were usually built into a keyboard, this one also had its tape deck embedded into it, and they also came standardly packed with a monitor. This meant little Jimmy could play his computer games without having to take away TV time from Dad. As far as budget products go, that was pretty revolutionary for the time. And if you were feeling really stingy, you could just buy the non-colour monitor.
The important thing to know is that Amstrad did try to make a game console, the GX4000, which was a design based on the existing CPC framework, meaning most of the software for the CPC worked on the GX4000. But the issue was, it was competing with the Atari ST and the Commodore Amiga, with big shoes to fill. Cliff Lawson, the designer, said that with a limited budget and library of games, the GX4000 didn't stand a chance. This would be the sole console Amstrad ever made, and they exited the game market soon after.
Well, we talked about Amstrad. What's one more computer company to add to the fray? Commodore? Now, as much as I personally adore the Commodore 64 itself, I warned Forte about the console I'm about to mention because, in my opinion, it is the worst way to try to play Commodore 64 games. The Commodore 64 game system, C64GS or C64 got screwed if you've ever purchased one, as the name implies, the GS was capable of playing C64 titles, but its success was limited by the hardware itself. The chips inside were the same as the home micro, but they removed the keyboard, meaning many games existing in the Commodore 64 library could not be played, including the original pack-in game Terminator 2 Judgment Day. So there was no exclusive software support, it was a pathetic excuse for a C64 alternative, and the market was already saturated by computers that worked. It was very much doomed to fail.
While Commodore had a rough time with their GS, maybe they could redeem themselves by making a video game system that revolved around their next great computer. If Philips could do it, why couldn't they?
If you remember in the last video, VTech is a Hong Kong-based company that was entirely dedicated to electronic learning products and has been since 1976. Their previous entry was the CreativeVision, and it was horrible. To be fair, most VTech products were aimed at infants or young children, and realistically the video game market was projected toward an age range that VTech could never hope to keep up with. However, in 1988, really late in the ballgame for the third generation, they released the VTech Socrates. It was a dedicated hardware console with a few educational games with the options for 9 more titles that were compatible with other peripherals. It would contain 5 major categories: math, word problems, word games, music games, and painting. It was great for kids, but it was slow. So slow that I don't even bother letting my kids play with it. If you had the opportunity to play edutainment titles on the NES during the time, then why even bother with getting a VTech console? That was their undoing, and while they would still create games on independent learning consoles such as Leapfrog, they wouldn't ever return to the mass video game market.
The VCR was a technological marvel for entertainment. You could record your favorite show, watch a movie with your family, hook up the NES and pop it in channel 3 or 4, and you were good to go for hours. Some companies wanted to utilize the VCR to play games, and as you would expect, it wasn't exactly the best idea. But toy companies loved the idea of making the next great thing, so they plowed ahead. After all, LJN, which was a toy company, would put tons of bloatware on the NES, using licensed names that mattered in our childhood. But while LJN did have an art-based console called the LJN Video Art, they had nothing to do with what we're talking about now, the Action Max, created by a separate toy company known as Worlds of Wonder.
The Action Max was a light gun VCR-based entertainment system. You hooked it up to the TV, took your fragile light gun, popped on the red light, and if you hit the target, the light flashed. And yeah, by the way, these games were 1 hour long and on tape. Once the tape was finished, the game was over. This meant that once you got a perfect score, there was 0 replayability. With a library of 5 games, Worlds of Wonder didn't even stand a chance. But it was important because it was one of the first VCR-based console ideas. Speaking of toy companies, do you remember the Viewmaster? It was a toy where you put these wheels with small images in this contraption. And when you pulled the lever, the picture spun. You had to look at a source of light, and it was like, I don't even know how to describe it. This is also technically a Mattel product, but it was created by the Viewmaster Ideal Group, so we didn't loop it in. Their console was known as Interactive Vision, and it was the wackiest console at the time. It had a rigid, horrible controller and a small library of games. The graphics were crudely rasterized on the screen, and it wasn't fun in the slightest. Viewmaster would not continue in the games industry.
So, there you have it, the third generation of game consoles. A time when industry leaders were dedicated to reviving a market that seemed all but destroyed, picking up the shattered pieces and gluing them back together, bearing the scars of their mistakes as a lesson to apply to the future. Nintendo and Sega, along with smaller companies such as BBC Enterprises, Dina, and Dendy, jointly took the responsibility of carrying the torch forward to ensure the video game industry's survival. As we venture into the fourth generation of video game consoles, we'll encounter innovative ideas, fresh concepts, and unparalleled ambitions. With the dust of the crash finally settling, the console war had only just begun.